Close your eyes for a second. Imagine the most powerful supercomputer ever built. It's training the AI model that will cure cancer, design next-gen fighter jets, write the next great American novel. It's doing all this simultaneously in a building the size of 15 football fields, somewhere in the Nevada desert. Now imagine that building going dark. Not because of a cyber attack, not because of a software failure, not because engineers made a mistake, but because the power bill came due and nobody could pay it. That's not a hypothetical. That is 2026. If you think this is just an energy, war, or tech story, you're wrong. This is all three, colliding at exactly the wrong time. Consequences will reshape the American economy for the next decade. This is money history. Today I want to walk you through something mainstream financial media keeps missing. The AI revolution and the Middle East war are not separate stories. They are the same story. And right now, that story is not going the way Silicon Valley promised you it would. Stick with me for the next 20 minutes. By the end of this video, you will see the global economy differently. Let's start with a number that should terrify every tech investor in America. 1,000 gigawatts. That is the estimated additional electricity demand AI data centers will require by this decade's end. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the entire current electricity consumption of India, the world's most populous country. We are talking about building an entirely new energy infrastructure just to power software. Here's what nobody in Silicon Valley wanted to talk about during the AI gold rush of 2023 and 2024. Artificial intelligence is, at its core, a physical technology. It is not like writing an app or launching a website. Training a large language model requires millions of specialized chips running at full power, continuously, for weeks or months. Think about what that means. A single training run for one of today's frontier AI models consumes hundreds of gigawatt hours. That's enough to power a typical American home for 9,000 years. Not 9 years. 9,000, and training is just the beginning. Once deployed, every query consumes electricity. At scale, across billions of users. This adds up fast. Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and Meta are in an arms race. They're building more data centers, more chips, more cooling systems. Every investment runs on one thing: cheap, reliable baseload power. In America, that baseload power comes primarily from natural gas, not solar, not wind. Natural gas. It runs our grid when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. It keeps lights on and servers humming. Which brings us to the problem. Natural gas doesn't just come from Texas and Oklahoma. A massive chunk of the world's natural gas supply comes from one region, the Middle East. Specifically, from a country at the center of one of the most dangerous geopolitical conflicts of our lifetime, Iran. Iran holds the second largest proven natural gas reserves on the planet. In early 2026, after years of escalating tensions, the region crossed a threshold that changed everything. When missiles hit, they didn't just take out military infrastructure, they disrupted global energy supply chains. LNG prices, liquefied natural gas, the fuel that powers our grid, spiked over 60%. Utility companies across the US pass those costs on to industrial consumers. And who are the biggest industrial electricity consumers? You guessed it, data centers. Here's a concept I want you to really sit with. Capital is not loyal. Money does not care about your mission statement. Capital goes where it can generate the highest risk-adjusted return. For the first time in 15 years, that's not Silicon Valley. Think back to 2009. The United States was crawling out of the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. Interest rates were at zero. Borrowing was essentially free. Money was embarrassingly easy to find. That era created the tech titans we know today. Uber, Airbnb, Stripe, OpenAI, all built on cheap capital and energy that they could afford to lose money for years while they scaled, because borrowing to fund that growth cost almost nothing. That world is gone. The inflation triggered by the Middle East conflict forced the Federal Reserve into a corner. When oil prices spike, every input cost rises. The Fed's only real tool to fight inflation is raising interest rates, and that's exactly what they did. The federal funds rate climbed back above 5% by mid-2026, sending shockwaves through the startup ecosystem. Consider what high interest rates mean for a company trying to build a billion-dollar AI data center. You're not just talking about construction costs. You're talking about the cost of borrowing the money to finance that construction. At 5% interest, a $1 billion loan costs $50 million per year just in interest. That math stops working very quickly. And it's not just startups feeling this. Big tech companies are also recalibrating. Capital expenditure plans are being scaled back. At the same time, there's a massive pull in the opposite direction. War is expensive. The US government is funding emergency military aid. Defense contractors are hiring. The defense industry budget is expanding. In Washington, the political calculus is simple. So, the money moves from bits to atoms, from software to steel, from San Francisco to the Pentagon's supply chain. This is what economists call a crowding out effect, historically devastating for innovation cycles. When governments consume massive capital and talent to fight wars, the private sector shrinks, research slows down, breakthroughs get delayed. We saw it in the 1940s, we saw it in the early 1950s, we are seeing it again now. I want to tell you about the most important building in the global economy. It's not in New York, it's not in Washington, it's not in Silicon Valley. It's in Hsinchu, Taiwan. TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, is the most critical industrial facility on Earth. It manufactures 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors. The chips inside your iPhone, the chips inside NVIDIA's H100, the GPU essential for the AI revolution, chips inside military guidance systems, medical devices and financial trading platforms. There is no redundancy, no plan B if TSMC stops producing chips for any reason. The global tech industry grinds to a halt within months, not years, months. Now, here's the geopolitical nightmare. Taiwan exists in one of the most precarious positions. China considers the island a breakaway province, to be reunited by force if necessary. The United States considers Taiwan a critical strategic partner. Its policy is strategic ambiguity. The Middle East conflict has made this situation dramatically more dangerous. Here's why. When the United States is already stretched thin militarily, financially, diplomatically, adversaries notice. Beijing has been watching the American response to the Middle East crisis very carefully. Every carrier group deployed to the Persian Gulf is one not patrolling the Taiwan Strait. Every $1 billion committed to Middle East allies is not spent modernizing Pacific Command. Every political debate about America's role is a signal about American resolve, or the lack of it. Now layer on top of this the energy problem. TSMC's manufacturing process is extraordinarily energy-intensive. Photolithography machines require incredibly precise temperature and humidity control. Fabrication facilities run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, consuming power comparable to a small city. If global energy prices remain elevated, TSMC's own production costs rise. Those costs get passed through the supply chain. Chips get more expensive. Expensive chips mean more expensive AI infrastructure. Higher barriers to entry for startups, higher costs for established players, and slower deployment of the technology that was supposed to transform everything. And that's the optimistic scenario, the one where Taiwan remains stable. The pessimistic scenario is one that defense analysts are increasingly refusing to dismiss. China uses this moment of American distraction and financial overextension to accelerate its timeline on Taiwan. Not necessarily a full military invasion that would be catastrophic for everyone, including China, but a blockade. An economic squeeze, a show of force designed to demonstrate that American dominance is over. If that happens even partially, the semiconductor supply chain doesn't just get more expensive, it breaks. And without chips the AI revolution doesn't slow down, it stops. There's a phrase thrown around in venture capital, growth at all costs. The idea was simple. In a world of near-zero interest rates, time was cheap. Acquire users fast, capture market share quickly. Amazon lost money for years. Uber lost money for a decade. Netflix burned cash while it expanded globally. Investors didn't care, because borrowing costs almost nothing. That business model was a product of a specific historical moment, the post-2008 era of quantitative easing. It created an entire generation of tech companies subsidized by monetary policy. War ends that subsidy. When a major conflict disrupts global energy and commodity markets, it doesn't just raise prices at the pump. It creates persistent, broad-based inflation, the kind that is very hard for central banks to control. Supply chains get disrupted, shipping costs rise, insurance premiums for goods traveling through conflict zones spike. All of these costs flow through to the prices consumers pay for everything. The Federal Reserve's mandate is to keep inflation under control. Its only real tool is interest rates. So when war-driven inflation proves sticky and persistent, the Fed has no choice but to keep rates elevated, potentially for years. For the tech industry, this creates a brutal feedback loop. High rates make borrowing expensive. Expensive borrowing makes growth at costs impossible. Companies valued on future profits find valuations evaporating. When your cost of capital doubles or triples, every financial model in your spreadsheet changes. We're not talking about minor adjustments. Companies worth $50 billion in 2024 being worth $15 billion in 2026, not because the technology got worse, not because the team got worse, but because the macro environment shifted. And this hits AI companies particularly hard, because AI is among the most capital-intensive industries ever created. The upfront costs are staggering: compute, talent, energy, data, infrastructure. The payoff period is long and uncertain, and the competitive pressure is intense. If you need cheap money to fund a multi-year development cycle, and cheap money disappears, you have a serious problem. There's also a talent dimension here that rarely gets discussed. The best AI researchers are extraordinarily expensive. Compensation packages of $1 million a year are not unusual at the top of the field. But if companies competing for that talent are under financial pressure, if stock options have lost value, some of that talent starts to look elsewhere. Where does it go? Defense contractors are paying very well right now. Government labs with national security missions are hiring. The flow of exceptional technical talent away from civilian AI and toward military applications is already visible, and it's accelerating. Innovation doesn't disappear, but it gets redirected, and redirected toward what, exactly, depends on who controls the funding. So let me bring this all together. We are living through a collision between two of the most powerful forces in modern history: the technological revolution driven by artificial intelligence, and the geopolitical upheaval driven by conflict in the Middle East. These forces are not happening in parallel. They are interacting with each other, and right now, the interaction is deeply, profoundly negative for the future of American technology leadership. The AI revolution required for things to succeed: cheap energy, cheap capital, reliable chip supply, and political stability. The Middle East war is systematically attacking all four simultaneously. Energy is no longer cheap. The disruption to global natural gas markets has raised the cost of powering data centers and running inference at scale. Every kilowatt-hour is more expensive than it was 2 years ago, and there's no near-term relief in sight. Capital is no longer cheap. The inflationary pressure from the conflict has kept interest rates elevated, far longer than any economist predicted coming into this decade. The era of free money that built Silicon Valley is over. Chip supply is no longer guaranteed. The pressure on Taiwan has introduced a level of geopolitical risk into the semiconductor supply chain that simply didn't exist 5 years ago. Every data center investment now carries a tail risk that nobody has a good way to price, and political stability. In an election year, with the United States committing hundreds of billions to military aid, while domestic infrastructure crumbles, the political environment for AI investment has never been more uncertain. The question of whether Washington will provide the regulatory clarity, the research funding, and the long-term policy support that AI development needs is genuinely open. Now, I don't want to leave you with pure doom. History is not deterministic. The United States has faced compounding crises before and found ways to innovate through them. The DARPA model, using defense's funding to seed technologies that later become commercial platforms, has a genuinely remarkable track record. The internet itself came from a Defense Department project. GPS came from the military. Many of the foundational technologies of the modern economy were initially funded by national security priorities. There is a scenario, not guaranteed, but real, where the pressures of this moment actually accelerate some critical developments. Energy independence becomes an existential national priority, not just a talking point. Nuclear power, specifically advanced small modular reactors, gets the political and financial backing it has needed for years. Domestic semiconductor manufacturing, supported by the CHIPS Act and its successors, starts to actually compete with Taiwan. The shock of this moment forces America to build the resilient, distributed infrastructure that it probably should have been building for the last 20 years. But here's the uncomfortable truth that I think every tech enthusiast, every startup founder, every VC and every investor in this audience needs to sit with. That better outcome doesn't happen automatically. It requires choices. Difficult, expensive, politically contentious choices. It requires deciding that energy independence is more important than short-term energy costs. It requires deciding that domestic chip manufacturing is worth subsidizing even when it's not yet competitive on price. It requires deciding that the AI revolution is a national priority comparable to the space race and funding it like one. And right now, in 2026, I'm not sure America has made those choices. Not yet. The instinct, when under financial and military pressure, is to cut, to conserve, to focus on immediate threats, rather than long-term strategic positioning. That instinct is understandable, but it's exactly backwards. The countries that will lead the next chapter of the AI era are not the ones that pause their ambitions because of short-term turbulence. They are the ones that use the turbulence as a forcing function to build faster, smarter, and with more urgency. The question is whether America is one of those countries. And that question is not going to be answered in a Palo Alto boardroom or a Stanford lecture hall or a Senate hearing room. It's going to be answered in the choices we make over the next 18 months, in what we fund and what we defund, in what we prioritize and what we sacrifice, in whether we look at this crisis as a reason to retreat or as a reason to build. The future of the digital revolution is not being written in code. Right now, it's being written in the geopolitical decisions, being made in Washington, in Beijing, in Tehran, and in the Strait of Hormuz. And it's being written by whether you, watching this video right now, understand what's actually at stake and demand better. If this video made you see something differently, hit subscribe. Drop a comment below and tell me, Do you think America can pull this off, or are we already too far behind? And share this with someone who still thinks the AI boom is unstoppable, because this conversation needs to be a lot bigger than it currently is. This is Money History. I'll see you in the next one.